Hello everyone. Today I want to discuss some segments of the book Light of the World. It was a book-length interview. Peter Seewald interviewed Pope Benedict XVI, and this interview took place around 2009. Peter Seewald, he really seemed like an eco-nut. He referred a number of times to the climate catastrophe, how basically our Earth is in so much danger, and this was, well over 10 years ago. So you can see how embarrassing that is today. But I do want to read you these segments, and I'm going to have minimal commentary here, so you can form your own opinions. And so let's get started. Seewald asks about the SSPX. The lifting of the excommunications of 4 bishops of the SSPX in January 2009. Was the lifting of the excommunication a mistake? And Benedict says, something ought to be said here perhaps about the lifting of the excommunication itself. For an incredible amount of nonsense was circulated, even by trained theologians. It is not true that those 4 bishops were excommunicated because of their negative attitude towards Vatican II, as was often supposed. In reality, they were excommunicated because they had received episcopal ordination without a papal mandate. It was handled according to the applicable canon of the old canon law then in force. According to that canon, those who consecrate others as bishops without a papal mandate and those who are thus consecrated are to be excommunicated. They were excommunicated, therefore, because they violated papal primacy. There is an analogous situation in China where bishops were likewise consecrated without a papal mandate and hence were excommunicated. However, when a bishop professes his acknowledgement both of the primacy in general and also that of the currently reigning pope in particular, his excommunication is revoked because there is no more reason for it. That is what we are doing in China, in 2009, hoping thereby slowly to resolve the schism. And so we proceeded also in the cases concerned here. In short, for the sole reason that they had been consecrated without a papal mandate, they were excommunicated, and for the sole reason that they now pronounce the acknowledgement of the Pope, albeit not yet following him on all points, their excommunication was revoked. That is per se quite a normal canonical procedure. Incidentally, I must say that this matter, our public relations work, was a failure. It was not explained adequately why the bishops had been excommunicated and why they now, for purely canonical reasons, had to be absolved from the excommunication. It seems like it still hasn't been resolved, but they're no longer excommunicated. In regards to the abuse crisis, Benedict is asked, have you thought of resigning? Benedict says, when the danger is great, one must not run away. For that reason, now is certainly not the time to resign. Precisely at a time like this one, must stand fast and endure the difficult situation. That is my view. One can resign at a peaceful moment or when one simply cannot go on, but one must not run away from the danger and say that someone else should do it. Question: is it possible then to imagine a situation in which you would consider a resignation by the Pope appropriate? Benedict says, yes. If a pope clearly realizes that he is no longer physically, psychologically, or spiritually capable of handling the duties of his office, then he has a right, and under circumstances, also an obligation to resign. So this was a precursor to his resignation, and if people had read about this before his resignation, then they wouldn't have been surprised. The question: do you think the Catholic Church could really get around having the Third Vatican Council? Benedict said, in all, we have had more than 20 councils, and surely there will be another one someday. At the moment, I do not see the prerequisites for it. I believe that at the moment the bishop synods are the right instrument in which the entire episcopate is represented and is, so to speak, searching, keeping the whole church together at the same time leading her forward. Whether then someday the moment will come again to do this in a major council, that we should leave to the future. At the moment we need above all those spiritual movements in which the universal church, drawing upon her current experiences and at the same time coming from the interior experience of faith and its power, sets up guideposts and thereby makes God's presence the central focus again. So he talks about not necessarily needing a Vatican III, but the bishops' synods are adequate to do that. Is he talking about like the synods that occur under Pope Francis? Because that is certainly what many people believe is maybe necessarily in place of the Third Vatican Council, sort of doing the same thing as a Third Vatican Council would do. Here we get into some serious German guilt. So the question is, and it's a long one, Jewish organizations welcome your election as the 265th leader of the Universal Church with an enthusiasm second to none. Israel Singer, at the time president of the World Jewish Congress, stated that already during his tenure as a prefect of the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith, Joseph Ratzinger had articulated the underpinnings for the rapprochement between the two world religions. Singer went on to add that you had changed the 2,000-year history of relations between Judaism and Christianity for the better. You were the first pope to invite a rabbi to address a synod of bishops. You halted the beatification process of a French priest who was alleged to have made anti-Semitic speeches. You have visited more synagogues than all of your predecessors in the papal office. At the time of your election, the German newspaper Süddeutsche Zeitung reported that in his writings he professes the Jewish origins of Christianity more eloquently than any pope before him. Your very first official act as successor of Peter was a letter to the Jewish community of Rome. Was this symbolic gesture meant to convey a basic thrust of the pontificate? Benedict says, absolutely. I must say from the very first day when I began to study theology, the intrinsic unity of the Old and New Covenants and the two parts of Holy Scripture was somehow immediately clear to me. I realized that we can read the New Testament only together with what preceded it. Otherwise, we would completely fail to understand it. And as Germans, we were of course shaken by what happened in the Third Reich, which gave us a special reason to look with humility and shame and with love upon the people of Israel. As I have just said, it is already during my theological studies that these things came together and began to shape the course of my thinking as a theologian. For this reason, it was clear to me, hereto in full continuity with Pope John Paul II, that this new, loving, sympathetic interrelation of Israel and the Church, where each respects the being and distinctive mission of the other, had to play an essential part in my proclamation of the Christian faith. Question. Your predecessor called the Jews our elder brothers. You speak of them as our fathers in faith. Answer. The phrase elder brothers, which had already been used by John the 23rd, is not so welcome to the Jews. The reason is that in the Jewish tradition, the elder brother, Esau, is also the brother who gets rejected. One can still use it because it expresses an important point, but it is true that they are also our fathers in faith. And this way of putting it illustrates perhaps even more clearly the character of our relationship to each other. I would actually, personally, John the Son of Thunder, I would say that the elder brother would be more fitting for Cain and Abel, for the Jews and the Christians. But that's just me. In regards to Bugnini's Holy Week, the question, on the other hand, the decision stirred up a controversy surrounding the petition for the conversion of the Jews that was contained in the Good Friday liturgy of the Old Mass. The New York rabbi and historian Jacob Neusner defended this position, arguing that it reflects the logic of monotheism. Even believing Jews, Neusner pointed out, pray 3 times a day, and eventually all non-Jews will call upon the name of Yahweh. You eventually had this text replaced by a new wording in February 2008. Could you understand the arguments of the critics? Here's Benedict's answer. First of all, I am very grateful to Rabbi Neusner for what he said because it was genuinely helpful. Second, this petition does not affect the liturgy in general, but only a small circle of people who use the Old Missal. So there was no question of any change in the main liturgy, that's the Novus Ordo. But in the old liturgy, this point seemed to me to require a modification. The old formulation really was offensive to the Jews and failed to express positively the overall intrinsic unity between the Old and New Testament. For this reason, I believe that a modification of this passage in the Old Liturgy was necessary, especially, as I have already said, out of consideration for our relation to our Jewish friends. I altered the text in such a way as to express our faith that Christ is a Savior for all, that there are not two channels of salvation, so that Christ is also the Redeemer of the Jews and not just of the Gentiles. But the new formulation also shifts the focus from a direct petition for the conversion of the Jews in a missionary sense to a plea that the Lord might bring about the hour of history that when we may all be united. So the polemical arguments with which a whole series of theologians assailed me are ill-considered. They do not accurately reflect the reality of the situation. Really, what he said makes no sense. The Jews are certainly part of the plan of salvation if they convert to the Catholic faith. So more on the SSPX. The question is, for the first 4 years, the Pope had been doing a good job, to put it colloquially. His opponents had literally been silenced, but things changed in January 2009, and all at once the vicious attacks started coming up as well. A certain portion of the press resurrected the charge that Pope Benedict is an ice-cold technocrat. We touched on the event that triggered this reaction at the beginning of the interview, the lifting of the excommunication of 4 bishops of the Society of St. Pius X, which had broken off from Rome, so they say, under the French Archbishop Marcel Lefebvre. At the present time, the Society comprises, according to its own account, around 600,000 members, 500 priests, and over 200 seminarians, 86 schools, and 2 institutions of higher education. To start with, you must have assumed that this step would bring anything but approval in the world of public opinion. Is that not right? The advantage to be gained was actually rather slight, whereas the risk of damage was considerable, Benedict says. That is correct. I have already explained that this step is to a large extent parallel to what we are doing in China. When bishops who are under excommunication because they have offended against the primacy later acknowledge the primacy, they are justly freed from the excommunication. In other words, their excommunication had nothing to do with Vatican II, but as I have already said, have been pronounced on account of an offense against the primacy. But now they had written a letter declaring their yes to the primacy, and the next step was therefore quite clear from a canonical point of view. Incidentally, already under John Paul II, an assembly of all the heads of the dicasteries, that is, all those in charge of Vatican bureaus, had decided to lift the excommunication in the event a letter of this kind was sent. Unfortunately, the public relations work was not done well from our side, so that the real canonical substance and the limits of the process were never made clear. Then to top it all off, there was a total meltdown with Williamson, which we had unfortunately not foreseen, and that is a particularly distressing circumstance. So what this seems to indicate is that if a society like the SSPX consecrates bishop without the approval of Rome, all they have to do is send a letter acknowledging the papal primacy to Rome, and then they will be unexcommunicated. That's news to me, but that seems to be what Benedict is indicating here. The question, would you have signed the decree lifting the excommunication if you had known that among the 4 bishops there was a person who denied the existence of the Nazi gas chambers? Yeah, I think it happened after an interview where the camera was still rolling and some interviewers asked Williamson what he thought about it, and he gave his answer. Now Benedict says no, meaning he would not have lifted the excommunication. If I had known, the first step would have been to separate the Williamson case from the others. Unfortunately, though, none of us went to the internet to find out what sort of person we were dealing with. So what this also indicates is that excommunication is based on the whims of what the Pope's opinions are. It's not an excommunicable offense to deny certain things about certain historical events. That's not an excommunicable offense. Question, shouldn't the very first step before lifting an excommunication have been to scrutinize the excommunicated persons and examine carefully how they conducted their lives, especially when you were dealing with a community whose isolation had skewed its development in a direction that was both theologically and politically dubious? So you can see the bias here in these questions. Benedict says it is correct that Williamson is an atypical case in that he was when you think about never Catholic in the proper sense. He was an Anglican and then went over directly to Lefebvre. This means that he has never lived in the great church. The Novus Ordo Church is a great church. I would disagree with that. And that he has never lived with the Pope. Our offices that are in charge of dealing with these matters assured us that all 4 bishops were unreservedly ready to accept the primacy, but of course one is always more intelligent in hindsight. And the last quote I want to leave you with is actually a positive one. There are some very concerning quotes that I have read, but these quotes from Pope Benedict are pretty positive. Question is, it is no secret that there are LMNOP even among priests and monks. Just recently there is a major scandal on account of the LMNOP passions of priests in Rome. Benedict said, LMNOP is incompatible with the priestly vocation. Whoa. Otherwise, celibacy itself would lose its meaning as a renunciation. It would be extremely dangerous if celibacy became a sort of pretext for bringing people into the priesthood who don't want to get married anyway. For in the end, their attitude toward man and woman is somehow distorted, off-center, and in any case is not within the direction of creation of which we have spoken. The Congregation for Education issued a decision a few years ago to the effect that LMNOP candidates cannot become priests because of their sexual orientation, estranges them from the proper sense of paternity, from the intrinsic nature of priestly being. The selection of candidates to the priesthood must therefore be very careful. The greatest attention is needed here in order to prevent the intrusion of this kind of ambiguity and to head off a situation where the celibacy of priests would practically end up being identified with the tendency to LMNOP. And the question, but there is no doubt that LMNOP exists in monasteries and among the clergy, if not acted out, then at least in a non-practiced form. Benedict said, well, that is just one of the many miseries of the Church. And the persons who are affected must at least try not to express this inclination actively in order to remain true to the intrinsic mission of their office. So I thought that was a good way to end it. Definitely contradicts the values of many in the hierarchy currently. And pray for the soul of Pope Benedict. This has been my reflection of reading you clips of the book-length interview, Light of the World, Pope Benedict XVI. Thank you so much for watching. We are the laity, and we will not be silent.